the art of thinking beyond the obvious. And today I have my special guest. He's a PhD in psychotherapy, or psychotherapies, coach and consultant with for over 30 years of experiencing integrating 21st century neuroscience in his work with clients. And of course, our debut author too, the author of the book Living a Trigger-Free Life, none other than Mr. Brian Desroches. Welcome, Mr. Brian, once again on Abstract Essay. And can you please introduce more about yourself that I missed?
Yes. Um, Besides being in private practice as a psychotherapist for over 3 decades, um, I I'm also a coach to the dental profession. I do a lot of workshops for dentists, and people say dentists, and I work a lot of them because they are very interested in their relationships and how do they manage difficult patients and patients that are scared. And so one of the things I've worked with them for those 30 years, workshops and presentations, using a lot of this neuroscience material has been how to manage their own emotional state and how to positively work with patients who are in various states of distress or questions. And that's been a wonderful learning experience for me, working with that profession and using the information, the communication skills, and what I understand and how I can apply practical neuroscience in those relationships, as with couples and with individuals too. So it's this, yeah. And I'm very pleased because the book has very many examples in it, some of which are dentists, as a matter of fact, but many of them are just plain ordinary folk like you and I, living our life and wanting to live it healthier, better, and freer from the
Mm.
constraints of what I often call the emotional tyranny of our old learnings and of our triggers, if you will.
Healthier indeed, healthier. And thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world, Mr. Brian. Thank you. And today let's talk about why your brain protects you from change, then the hidden neuroscience behind self sabotage. Explore why patterns like
Mm,
people pleasing and self
mm, mm,
criticism are
mm,
actually our
mm.
brain's productive attempts. So, what
Yes.
is all about, Mr. Brian?
Let me start by talking about our body's immune system. We all know, like with COVID, for example, that the body has an immune system. And it's fascinating what it does when the body recognizes some virus, some bacteria, a pathogen entering its field. Um, it will encode that and then also remember the signature of that pathogen. So it has a memory system, just like the brain, so that in the future, if first it will fight that pathogen off, and then if it encounters that pathogen again in the future, it immediately checks memory. And if it recognizes it, bango, it will do its immunoprotective mechanisms to make sure it obliterates, it gets rid of that pathogen because it is harmful and dangerous to the body. So we have an immune system that when a pathogen comes in, it learns about it, it has a memory about it, and that's why vaccines work. Basically, is the same process to protect us from harmful pathogens. So let's transfer that immune system concept to the brain's emotional immunity to change. All of us throughout our life have acquired what I call emotional pathogens. That is, our brain has associated events, behaviors, experiences, situations, even people with negative or harmful but negative emotions. And those experiences become emotional memories, most of which are unconscious to us. We don't know the memories being triggered. An example, I know how to use a fork. Most people know how to use a fork. Now, when I start to use a fork, I don't have to get out a manual that says that is the user's guide to using a fork. I just pick it up and start using it. And at one point in time, I didn't know how to use a fork. I had to learn it. But now it's become implicit memory. It's just pick up a fork and use it. We have thousands of procedures that we do during the day, you know, taking a glass of water. That's procedural memory. It's implicit. I don't have to read a manual that says, take your right hand and, I know how to do it. It's unconscious to us. Well, the same thing happens with our learning about emotions. If, as a child, for example, I wanted my daddy's attention, every child does, but every time I went for it, daddy was busy, and dads are busy. So I felt ignored. Like dad would say, no, later, 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 I'll talk to you later. So I have an emotional experience of that. Maybe rejection. Maybe it feels like rejection. That's not what my dad ever intended, but it feels like it. Or, the same thing that happened with your mother, or, or somebody, the children should be seen and not heard, and you speak a voice, and right away people look at you. Don't say anything. Shh. You learn, the brain learns emotionally, particularly in the first 7 years, that there are certain actions or certain situations or certain people that the brain associates with negative emotions, emotional pain. But that's unconscious. It's like the fork. And so what happens is, as we live those, we start to adapt because the brain is a survival mechanism. Its primary thing, it doesn't care if you're happy. It just wants to know you're going to be here tomorrow. And that's its focus. And I appreciate that. That works well under certain circumstances. But let's say I have an example of Mr. Nice Guy. In my 20s and early 30s, I was Mr. Nice Guy. I would people please. I would avoid conflict. I mean, and then I'd beat myself up afterwards for being such a wimp. Well, in my family of origin, you had to be very careful. I was raised in an alcoholic family. You didn't cause a lot of problems. You didn't want to disturb. You had to hide the shame. And so I learned to avoid conflict, to adapt to my world, to survive. But was that a conscious learning? No, not at all. It was my brain, because expressing myself, saying what I wanted, or taking a stand was an emotional pathogen for me. So that whenever before I became a psychotherapist, I was a hospital administrator. And boy, I've got a story in my book about that. One of the first big stories is I became Mr. Nice Guy. I was really good at that. I didn't realize then that it was automatic, learned protective behavior, the fawning and the people pleasing. But I had to. My brain had to do that to protect me from the emotional pathogen of suffering and pain, the rejection, the fear that I would experience based on my early learning in my family. So the brain is just doing what it naturally was designed to do, protect me from pain. But I didn't know that. All I know is I had to do it. I had to be Mr. Nice Guy. I didn't have a choice. I didn't have a choice. And that subsequently could change because I was able to update my brain. Now, that took many, many years, and boy, I'm still working on that. But that emotional pathogen now is a whisper. It is hardly there. And I'm not Mr. like crazy man, and but I can express myself. I can write. I can say no. And I don't fear rejection or physical threat any longer. My brain, I've updated my brain so that its emotional immunity to expressing myself no longer, let me put it this way, it's practically eliminated. Practically eliminated. And that's a big step. That's a big step. That process, the brain protects us from change. When that change involves pain, emotional pain, and you feel it. And I'm not talking about learning how to run a marathon. That you have a goal in mind. I'm talking about something you really want to do. Let's say, I so many examples I can give you. So many examples where the emotional pathogen, once you've identified it, the threat of that emotional pathogen, then you can actually eliminate it from your brain and free you from the trigger, free you from the reaction. It's yeah, yeah, it's a paradigm shift in many ways for my profession.
Interesting, Mr. Brian. And tell us the central idea is the behaviors like people pleasing and self criticism are the brain's protective attempts. Can you explain what exactly the brain is trying to protect us from
Well,
when it engages in these painful patterns?
that's a that's a great question. Let's imagine, and I know a friend, for example, her primary negative story about herself is that um, I'm not good enough. I'm just not good enough, and I'll never be good enough. And it doesn't always come up, but it'll come up many times. And we've talked about it. And sometimes she'll make a joke about it because humor can be a protective mechanism. Now, how could a story that I've created, a belief in myself that I'm not good enough, there's something wrong with me, how could that be a protective mechanism? Isn't that the problem? And as a matter of fact, that's where most people focus is how do I change that thought, that story? I remember asking her once, gee whiz, and I'll call her Sarah. Okay. I remember asking Sarah, what would be different if you're in your life if you knew you were good enough? If you really felt, hey, I'm competent, I can deal with things, what would be different in your life? And she started to talk about it. Well, I'd be out doing things. I would be, boy, I'd be joining this organization. And I said to her, I said, well, go ahead and think about doing that. And she started to think about it. And she became anxious right away. Right away. And we talked more, and she's very open. And I said, well, what is the threat of doing that? She said, oh, she said, I remember what it was like. And we explored that a little bit. Even though we were friends, she was very open. We explored that a little bit. She said, I remember what it was like in grade school. My family did not have a lot of money, she said. We're kind of poor, and we lived in the poor end of town. And she said, I would get teased a lot. I would get teased. I'd go there because I wasn't wearing the right kind of clothes or something like this. She said it was terrible. And I learned that she said, how did you adapt to that? Because you have to adapt. She said, I withdrew. I kind of kept to myself. I was somewhat of a loner. I had a couple friends, somewhat of a loner. And she said, That's when I started to tell myself, there's something wrong with me. I'm not good enough. And I said that, and with that, I would withdraw because it felt true. And it still felt true to her today, even though this is a very competent, capable 55-year-old, 56-year-old woman with a great career, a great profession. It still felt true to her. So her way of protecting her from the shame and the rejection and the ridicule and the ostracism that she felt in grade school, particularly in grade 7 and 8, the way she dealt with that was to tell herself, there's something wrong with me. I'm flawed. That way she never had to be out in the world and risk the rejection all over again. Even though that would never happen, and it didn't happen, when the brain detected that that could happen by her being visible, by doing things out in the world, it automatically registered. Its threat assessment said, no, you cannot do that. Stop. Remember, you're not good enough. There's something wrong with you. And withdraw. And that's what she did. That was her protective mechanism. I know it seems so counter to what we do. We try to change those negative thoughts about ourselves. We do all this hard work, these affirmations and all this stuff, which don't work because we're not changing anything. We're not updating the learning that we originally acquired that we didn't know we acquired. That's why it's hard. This is a very different way to think about, our problems. It's a paradigm shift. And so it's hard to believe, like you're asking, Daniel, it's like, how could negative thoughts be protective? What would you be doing if you didn't have those negative thoughts? Then you see the threat. You get the threat. What would you be doing differently? And usually that's when you get at what the threat really is. And so, give me my negative thoughts. They'll protect me from ostracism, rejection, abandonment, even physical endangerment. Yeah.
So, Mr. Brian, how do you distinguish between a genuine protective instinct that keep us safe and maladaptive or
That's
maladaptive?
in other words, one a behavior that we do that's instinctual as opposed to learned. Example: there are areas in Seattle where I will not walk at night. No way, because just the thought of walking at night is a little frightening, and so my instinctual brain is telling me, no, don't do that. Obey red lights. Don't drive through red lights. There's certain things that's why we have rules, is to kind of set parameters in a society, rules and laws. An instinctual behavior is one in which the body genuinely feels threatened based on its survival instincts, what's called the reptilian brain. I've had two occasions. One I remember still very vividly, when I was held up at gunpoint, and I was like 18 or 19. And when I remember it now, I don't have the visceral reaction that I had back then. It was terror, having a gun pointed at you. But I've done EMDR on that, and that's like a memory. I don't get the reaction anymore because it's been metabolized, if you will. That is a survival instinct. But a protective pattern, you could look at them in three ways. One is patterns where we push away something: conflict, blame, criticism, sarcasm, and ultimately physical violence. We're pushing away the source of the irritation. That's what conflict is. That's what the pushing away. So we push away negatives. The next one is to withdraw and avoid. So when you think about fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, fight is one, that's the conflict. We're going to push it away. Freeze and fawn are examples of kind of pulling in, withdrawing, going inside. We've all had experiences of talking to people, and I mean, dentists have this a lot where they're talking to a patient and all of a sudden the patient's not there. I mean, they're there, but if you look in their eyes, they're not there because they have withdrawn, they have gone inside. The brain's protective mechanism based on memories has withdrawn inside. So they're not there, but they are. But they are there. So we have these, the fear, fight, then flight, withdraw and avoid. If you have a pattern of withdrawal and avoiding, let's say you have a pattern of getting into intimate relationships and it gets to a certain point and all of a sudden, and I have a story in the book about this, all of a sudden you feel this anxiety and you start telling yourself and your partner, I'm busy, I've got things, but this anxiety is a pattern. It's a pattern of don't get too close. But you don't know that. You just know that if you get close, it feels anxious, therefore it's a threat. But you don't know that what you learned when you were young was if people get too close to me, they will engulf me. They will take me over emotionally and I will lose myself. So therefore, I have to back away. I have to withdraw from the threat of being engulfed by someone else. Happens in families where one parent will find a surrogate spouse in one of the children because the marriage is kind of empty. And so they find a child who's a surrogate spouse emotionally. That child will be engulfed and they will have a hard time in the future having close relationships because the threat of engulfment, the loss of oneself, is a powerful threat to an organism. So one has to differentiate the patterns: withdraw and avoid, push away patterns, pull away from and avoid, or completely avoid, cut off completely, have no contact. I think they call that ghosting or something. There's some terms I'm still learning, but
Ghosting, yeah.
that's a kind of a withdrawal, an avoidance, and it's hard. It's hard. Or when you,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
go
I hope
ahead.
that kind of answered because people ask that a lot. Like, what's the difference between survival and one is emotional survival, but it feels like physical survival because the threats when we're young, we're so dependent on others for our life, for our survival. And then there is our survival instincts when our life is actually threatened, physically threatened. That's the survival oriented reptilian brain. Yeah, that's the basic difference, Daniel. Good question. I appreciate that. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Brian. Thank you. And in and logging. So I want to apologize, people. I want to repeat the question, Mr. Brian.
Sure.
For
Sure.
someone who has been in therapy for years and
Yeah.
understand their patterns intellectually, but
Right.
still feels stuck, what is the missing piece that your neuroscience focus approach provides?
Oh, another one's a really good question. That's a very common phenomenon. Uh, the One of the primary paradigms for psychotherapy is insight. If you understand the problem and its origin, or maybe its origin, then you can change it. Insight very seldom produces change at all, any real transformation. And it may frustrate. For me, I had a lot of insight in my problems when I was doing psychotherapy in my 30s and early 40s, late 20s to early 40s. I had a lot of insights, but nothing changed. And in fact, I thought it was my fault. There's something wrong with me. So when someone comes in, and I see people like this, they'll come in and they'll say, I've done therapy for 5 years, 6 years, 7 years. I understand my problems. I can soothe myself after they happen, but nothing has really changed. Then that is the clue that the cause of that problem is an early emotional learning. The brain still creates that problem to protect you from something that you don't know you learned. And then when you touch into what it is that you learned, it will actually feel true to you. Because the emotional brain does not know time. Your thinking brain knows time. Your emotional brain does not know time. That's why we can have memories and it feels good right now. And that's why post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, is because the emotional brain does not know time. So if today I experience something, or there's an event going to happen, or I want to do something, and my brain learned a long time ago, if you do that, you will suffer. And I don't know it, I just feel it. Bingo. So if somebody comes in, the first thing I want to say to them is that you've got all this knowledge. Let's go underneath the anxiety. Let's go underneath there, because underneath, in the depths of your unconscious, lies the threats that no longer exist, but they feel like they do, and they will drive all the problems and symptoms you've been trying to change for 10, 15, 18 years. I mean, that's a bold claim to make, and I have no problem making it.
So, Mr. Brian, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. Mr. Brian, we are lagging, and I apologize for the lagging. So, can you please invite our listeners to support you again? Share your knowledge and wisdom to the world. We are lagging again. We're lagging. My apologies. And Mr. Brian, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world. So, can you please invite our listeners to
Thank you.
support your book, your advocacy, or any projects that you're doing right now?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. I just want to get the word out to people that I know, like myself, who suffer and really want to make deep fundamental change for themselves, their families, their work environments. Living a trigger-free life points a different way, a new path for enduring transformation.
Yes, people, let's support Mr. Brian Desroches, because if you support him, for sure, more and more empowering books like this to come. So, Mr. Brian, thank you so much for your time.
You're very welcome, Daniel. Thank you.
More to come.
Many blessings.
More, yes, more to come, people. See you soon.